Welcome to week 5 of It's Complicated as we sit with Jason Mitchell and just talk a little bit more about the message and maybe some stuff that didn't quite make it in there. So Jason, thanks so much for taking some time to hang out with us.
Absolutely.
Now I got to ask this, all right, because not everyone feels comfortable talking about sex, all right, and then you get up in front of
I don't feel comfortable talking about it.
I'm just asking because we got a couple thousand, 17-ish thousand people who tune in.
Yeah.
I mean, most people can't even talk about it with their kids or their spouse. Just, there's an awkwardness to it.
Yep.
So who decides who speaks on this? Like, did you choose it or did you draw the short straw? How does that work?
So here's the honest truth. We do kind of script out what we're going to do, and I don't really know how we determine who gets what, but I will say this. This is a topic I'm very passionate about, and so I don't mind it, but it's also weird getting up and talking about sex.
Good to know. All right, so you're human. You got those.
Oh, yeah. There's parts of it where I'm blushing or whatever. But I also know, like I said, everyone's already talking about it. And so even like with my kids, like I've got a 10-year-old and a 12-year-old and a 15-year-old. And listen, there's a part of me that's like, oh, should we have them in the room when we talk about this? And I'm like, they're already hearing about it on their bus. They're already hearing about it in their music. They're already hearing about it. So I'd rather the church be the safe place to talk about, as awkward as it is. So I'd rather kind of go into those awkward conversations. But I feel that too.
And I mean, you said it again, like it was age 9, it's the first time you were exposed to something. So,
absolutely.
Parents, if you don't know how to talk about it, just bring your kids into this conversation and there you go.
Well, I don't know if we're going to solve anything here.
Good. Well, we're going to talk about some stuff that I think will be helpful. And the first is, let's just jump in here. Why is this so important for the church to address? I'm sure for some it feels uncomfortable, but we can't shy away from it. So why is it so important? We just hit it head on.
2 reasons. One more positive and the other a little bit more negative. Positively, the Bible talks about the Bible talks about sex throughout. Mm-hmm. It addresses issues of sexuality and sexual intimacy throughout. So in other words, you can't read the Bible, you can't explore faith in Jesus without eventually needing to confront this and to talk about this, because it's all over the scriptures. And as I said earlier, it's all over the scriptures in a positive way. Mm-hmm. Sex was given to humanity in Genesis 2 before the fall, before sin entered in the picture. In other words, this was good and blessed and great and all this. And sometimes I think we think of sex, and some of you probably grew up in traditions or church traditions where they talked about sex as bad and dirty almost, or to be sort of, ugh. And that's just not the picture you see in the scriptures. And so one is like so why we have to talk about this is, one, from a positive standpoint, to bring positive vision to what healthy, God-honoring sexuality can look like. Now let me talk about the negative side where we have to talk about this. Jason, I mean this. When I say countless, it's countless. It is countless stories I could tell of sitting down across the table as a pastor for men and women who their marriage has fallen apart. They're living with shame. They're living with all this. And if you begin to trace it back, they will tell you stories about sexual brokenness, about an affair, about pornography, about the ways that they were treated, or the ways they treated others in college or whatever, in high school, whatever it might be, sexually. How it's still, they live with this. I hate that, and it's still. So my point is, this affects us. This is why Paul said in 1 Corinthians 6. He says that sex is unlike, sexual immorality is not like other sins. Right. Now, all sins are equal in their weight, like they all bring the same consequence of separating us from God, but they're not all equal in what the effect they have on us, right?
And that's what Paul says.
That's what Paul's talking about, right? And so what he says there is this is a sin against the body. And I just see that as a pastor. I see that over and over and over again, people living with regret. Because we haven't talked about this, or they haven't ever thought about this.
Yeah, and that's why we take the time to talk about it. So again, even if you're at home and you're feeling comfortable on weeks like this, people need to hear it, both in that positive light and just because of some of the baggage that they're dealing with. And so let me ask you this, because you hit on it a little bit already. When we think about really people, some within the church, and especially those outside of the church, think God is anti-sex. But you even said, hey, pre-fall, when God said everything was good, sex was included in that. So maybe where do some of those false beliefs come from? Like, why do people equate God with anti-sex?
Well, I think, honestly, some of it's because Christians haven't known what to do with it. And so this is it's a good example of, like, there's a lot of things that it's not the thing that's wrong. It's when sin gets entered into the thing that it becomes tainted and distorted and warped. Money is not bad.
Right.
When sin gets mixed in with money, greed, well, I steal, I embezzle. I mean, like that's all sorts of different greed. I, go into debt and kill my family because of whatever this. Let me try to think of another. Food is not wrong.
Yeah.
When it gets distorted and now it's unhealthy. I mean, like, so things are things. Sex is not wrong. It's when sin gets mixed in with, and it becomes distorted and warped. What happens though, I think sometimes is that's a complicated conversation to have. And it's a lot easier to just go black or white. This is why my grandfather, he grew up, do not ever play cards. He wasn't allowed to go to a movie house. I think that's what they called it back then, a theater. Why? Because it's easier to keep the conversation at that level and just go, all right, let's just be black and white about this and don't ever go to movies. Don't ever, don't ever play cards because then you might gamble. Don't ever, and then it's like the sex thing. Don't do these, don't do that, don't do this, don't do that, don't do this, don't do that. And after, after hearing that enough, you begin to think, oh, sex, every part, it must be bad. As opposed to, no, sex is beautiful, wonderful, great in its context. And that's the conversation I think that's been lacking sometimes. And so we equate, because that's a more complicated, it's a more nuanced conversation to have about sex. It's more positive. It's a more visionary conversation, but it's just easier to go, just don't do it.
Right. So it's like, hey, I could follow a list of rules versus, hey, I have to exercise wisdom and think through the proper context. Yeah, I think maybe that's a good point from maybe how the church has communicated about sex and why then people perceive it as, oh, God is this anti-sex, just kind of boring, killjoy, when really he wants us to have a great sex life in the right context.
Yes, that's right. That's right. And the abstinence sort of movement, like it's a lot easier to tell someone just don't do it, which there's a part of that, right? That's good. The problem is if you never give them though, but what are we running towards? And that's the vision that we talked about a lot this weekend. Is there's a vision for sex that God has. It's not just don't do something. It's there's something greater. So I think that's where I'm interested in talking a lot more about it.
I love that. And so we know that our culture cheapens sex a ton. I mean, and particularly in the media, if you think in entertainment. And so you could probably list a dozen, but in your mind, what's the number one way that entertainment, media just cheapens what sex is designed to be?
That's a great question. Man, we could talk forever on this kind of stuff. Listen, we want to think that we've evolved. We're so progressive nowadays and culturally that we've evolved, and that thinking about sex as something that should be cherished is like an antiquated, repressive idea. And yet, why are we still having the Me Too movement? Why are we still having sexual exploitation at the levels that we are? Why are we still feeding our minds with music that makes women objects? And men predatory. I mean, like all this kind of stuff. This is the narrative that we're sold a lot. Okay. And so that's, I see that all the time and this is what's so interesting to me is in the name of freedom, sexual freedom, we've only reinforced the sexual stereotypes. Like I can do whatever I want to in my body. So I'm going to do whatever I want to in my body. And all we did was reinforce that our bodies are just bodies. So they're like deep conversations in some ways, but they're really necessary to reflect on because we are, as I said earlier, we're all being sold a script. We're being told a story about sex and its value and what it's for and how to have great sex and all this kind of stuff. And we don't even know we're picking it up. We're just picking it up, and we need to challenge that. We need to challenge it. We need to challenge it big time.
I love that. It's very, very thought-provoking how just that message that we're sold and how do we challenge it? How do we renew our mind to really get to that point of this is what God has created for, and here's what the beauty is, again, in its context. And I love the quote you used tonight, and I won't be able to say it verbatim, but essentially the idea is nobody, even the younger generation, sets out to get an STD or to just have cheap sex and to use their body as a physical instrument. Nobody's really looking for that. But yet you get yourself kind of in that mode We start to believe the lies that I have to do this. Like, hey, are we sexually compatible?
Yes.
Hey, like, don't we have the right to explore, to experience these things?
Yep.
And so we buy into those lies. And yet we don't believe them at our heart level because we carry around that baggage and that pain. And so what makes it so hard to just break that cycle? Like, if we're not looking for that, if people aren't looking for that, I don't believe they are.
Yeah.
Now, how do we help them get out?
Well, I mean, a couple of different ways. I think one is we have to continue as the church to preach and to explore and to dive into the truth and the reality that we are, first and foremost, we are not sexual beings. We are spiritual. We are created for Christ, right? We were created for God on purpose. But sexuality has been elevated to such a high degree in our culture that we are sexual beings first. Mm-hmm. We define ourselves by our sexuality. So as Christians, we have a different story, which is who you are is you are loved by God. You are a daughter. You are a son of God. That's our identity. Mm-hmm. All the other things kind of fall in place. So one is we have to keep reinforcing our identity. That will break the bond. That will break some of the bonds of the sexuality side, because we realize that who we are is not tied to any sexual experience or anything like that. Like that's just not part of who we are. We also need to create such tight-knit community in our churches, in our groups, in our communities that we with other followers of Jesus, that we become, how do I say this? We become the relationships, the intimacy for each other that we long for, that sometimes we use sex as a reason to try to, I like how Erwin McManus says, we fake sex to try to find love. Mm-hmm. We used to fake love to try to get sex. It's different. We fake sex now to try to get love. And the point being there more like, we think sex is going to be the thing that hopefully delivers the connection, like we talked about. Well, listen, if you have a tribe of people around you that love you like you are, that will challenge you, that will hold you accountable, like I said, all of a sudden, those relationship needs, those connectedness needs, which we all have, intimacy, those are getting met by a new family, by a family of people who are saying, we're going after something higher, we're going after something. And so we have to continue, I think, as a church to create safe places for people to live the way of Jesus when it comes to even the area of sexuality, and will be held up to a higher vision for their life, but also loved and supported and connected. And then you're not going looking for it at different places. And so we got a lot of single people, who maybe are older and single. And man, what a beautiful thing to think that the church could be their spouse. And I'm not trying to get weird. I just mean the sense of like, I know people, I know singles who their whole life, and they don't look at that as a bad thing. They don't look at that because they found in the church intimacy.
That's powerful.
Yeah, it is a powerful thing. And so the more we do that, the more we also then break the bonds of having to go find that in other places, I guess.
Right, because it's kind of that need that we're seeking to meet that drives us to those places. And if we have those needs met, then all of a sudden it doesn't become appealing. It doesn't become as tempting.
It's like with Jenny, with Jenny, I always tell people, like, the best thing you can do for your spouse, the best gift I can give to Jenny, the best gift Jenny can give to me is to make me number 2 in her life. It's for me to make her number 2. And if your number 1 is Jesus, see, this is the irony. This is how it kind of works backwards, is if her number 1 in her life is Jesus Christ, she's pursuing Jesus, all of a sudden her need for me goes down. This is what's weird.
Yeah.
And you got to be okay with this. She doesn't need me as much. Because why? Because she's finding her fulfillment in Jesus. But now she actually wants me. Mm-hmm. And see, it's when you need someone to fulfill that thing in you, you're putting all of your trust in them, to be honest.
And that's where unhealth comes in, because then you're seeking that person to meet those needs that they were never designed to meet.
They were never designed to meet. That's right.
So good. So good. So let's speak to primarily the singles watching. This could be older, could be younger. I think one of the big lies that we buy into regarding sex, especially culture, is that, your best sex, the most passionate sex, all that kind of stuff is going to happen when you're exploring outside the context of marriage. And yet again, and I know as pastors who've talked with people over the years, that ultimately that just brings baggage and heartache and regret. And so why is it that the best sex is within the context of marriage and over time. And again,
Yes.
I know it sounds weird, but again, we have some couples that have been married, 30, 40 years that would say, hey, our sex life is better today
Yeah.
than it was when we were, young and married in our 20s.
Right,
and I know when you're young, you hear that.
And you're like, oh, sick.
yeah,
Oh,
yeah,
what's
right.
up
I don't
with it?
want that in my head. But yet, that's something that happens.
It's true.
And so, how is that a thing?
Well, okay, two things I'd say to that. One is statistically, research shows that there is no statistical difference in the quality of sex. So this is not even, again, not Christian research. You can read this in Mark Regnerus and Jeremy Euchre's research called Premarital Sex in America, I think is one of their books. You can read this. There's a book called Cheap Sex where Mark Regnerus explores this. Anyways, it's statistically shown that there's no difference in the amount of sex between a cohabitating couple and a married couple. So that's one, is when we get married, we're going to have less sex. It's just a lot. It actually is not true. And then the quality is actually, there's really no statistical difference at all. And in fact, it may go up in the context of marriage. Now, the reason why we believe, or it's not believe that, the reason why that's true is because experience doesn't fuel great sex. Exclusivity fuels great sex. So again, Bible affirms this, but research, no matter what research, it all affirms this. Like just sociological research shows this, is that when you are in a committed relationship, the trust is able, like the bonds of trust are able to be formed, which means that everything's on the table, right? You're not at risk. But when you don't have a commitment, you withhold the covenant making part. Now non-Christians wouldn't call it that, but that's what we would call it. But the way that non-Christians would call it would probably just say I can't fully trust them or whatever. You're not going to give yourself fully because you don't know if they're going to be around anymore. And so that's just natural. That's a good instinct, actually. Mm-hmm. The problem is you're still trying to create the oneness through the sex. And so what happens is sex loses its covenant making power and it actually gets detached from ability to create trust. Listen, there's a lot of counselors will tell you this. There's a lot of married couples who they were sexually active before they got married. Then they got married and there's trust issues. Mm-hmm. It has nothing to do with you were with someone else or anything like that. It's because something innate in them felt a little bit used back here without a commitment that they still kind of carry into it. That happens. That happens. And again, it's because we're trying to get the oneness without the oneness. Yeah. You know what I mean?
Absolutely. And so I'd love to close on this thought. And I love the illustration you used, this thought that we're all writing a story. All of our lives, that we're writing a story, they're going somewhere. And what kind of story do we want to tell someday? Mm-hmm. Tell with our spouse, tell with our grandkids, tell with our kids. People are out there. They've made mistakes. They have some of that baggage. They have some of that regret. And so, if you haven't yet, then keep pursuing God. Avoid that at all costs. But for those who have, how do we move forward? How do we start where we are?
Man, I love that you brought this up because this is how I'd love to end too. I got baggage. I got sexual baggage. Some of it was done to me. Some of it I chose. And I brought that baggage into my marriage. I brought that baggage into my relationship with Jenny. So I even mentioned in the story, like even the pornography stuff. Mm-hmm. 9 years old was my first. Well, it didn't stop then. I got baggage. Okay. I want you to know if that's you and you're sitting there going, man, what do we do? We've got these issues. It's okay. Because, and again, I cannot say this with enough passion. You are forgiven. God's grace will cover it. It will mean you need to reveal some things. Yeah. Because when we reveal, we heal. It may mean you need to confess some things. It may mean you need to put a stake in the ground and say, I've got some baggage, but I'm not going to carry that forward now. And so you confess to God. You say, yep, I've done these things. It wasn't your best. It wasn't your vision for sexuality. And God, I'm sorry for that. And I need your forgiveness for that. You do that, and then you trust that you've been forgiven, and you believe it, and you stand on that no matter what your shame tells you, no matter what the lies of the enemy tell you. And then you move forward differently. That's what repentance means. It means to turn around, which means if you're right now engaged in porn, if you're right now engaged in something like you're with your boyfriend or girlfriend and you're not living into God's vision, that means you may need to have an awkward conversation. You need to stop. So you ask for forgiveness. You've got it. You believe it. And you move forward and say, today I'm going to repent. I'm going to turn around. And if you mess up again today, that's okay. His mercies are new tomorrow, and you start again. And you do it again, and you pick up, you rely on God's grace that he's good, and you trust him, and you make then decisions based on that. So I want you to know there's hope. That's all. I really want people to know there's hope. Like you're not bound and you're not damned to your past. It doesn't define you.
Jason, thank you so much just for being vulnerable and for giving us that encouragement. Again, that there is hope no matter where you are, no matter what you've done. God's best is still ahead for you. And so continue to pursue it no matter what. Again, God wants our relationships to be fantastic, both marriage, with friendships, the whole thing. And we don't have to make them complicated. And so just continue to pursue Jesus, love others well. No matter where you're at today, you could choose God's best for your life tomorrow. And that's our encouragement to you. So thanks for tuning in. Thanks for hanging out with us. We love you guys, and we hope you have a great conversation.